Hello. So here we are. Last night was our gathering on Zoom for the Pluto class, and I mentioned to those who were present for that Zoom that I was going to be getting our videos done for Jupiter, which is what we're doing this month. And then next month, next new moon, so this is Sagittarius new moon. Next new moon is going to be Capricorn new moon, and that will be the theme of Saturn. And I quite like these. We had a bit of a general consensus that it was quite hard on some levels to extend all the way out to Pluto. Because Pluto isn't a personal planet, it felt quite hard to reach that perspective, although I was very impressed by how everyone did. You can feel the transpersonal planets are transpersonal, not personal. Now, Jupiter and Saturn are also not personal planets, but they are the bridge to get to the transpersonal planets. They are the gas giants. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create our Jupiter content here, give you this time to sit with Jupiter. We're going to see if on first quarter moon we get an opportunity to meet due to me being away, and then on the new moon, and then also the craziness that is the Christmas season. In the eventuality that it just gets too much for me or us, we will not meet for a Zoom solely for Jupiter. Then we will jump all the way to meeting for a Zoom for Jupiter and Saturn. And actually, I'm going to speak into the mythology a little bit first. And even here, you can see the really powerful and potent link between Jupiter and Saturn. So just to start with, saying that in traditional astrology, Jupiter and Saturn were the last two planets because we couldn't see beyond that. And I know that by now we're getting to a stage where you might find me repeating myself, but I think it's important that we just keep repeating information until it settles in. I don't know why the lighting is just, it's doing this kind of thing. Anyway, so in mythology, we did touch on this last month with Pluto, because Pluto is the brother of Jupiter. So I'm going to call Jupiter Zeus because that's what he was in Greek mythology, and then in the Roman mythology he became Jupiter. It's the same energy. Well, in fact, some of the times there's a bit of a change in vibe between the Greek to the Roman shift. Like Venus, from Aphrodite to Venus, she changes quite a lot. Like you can feel it. Whereas Jupiter's kind of similar to Zeus in energy. So the reason I mentioned this story last time would have tied into both Saturn, who's coming next, and Pluto, who was last, and the link there with Jupiter or Zeus. So Zeus was the final child of Saturn or Kronos and Rhea. And it was foretold, as I mentioned last time, to Saturn, Kronos, that he would have a fate similar to that which he had inflicted upon his own father, Uranus, where he had overthrown his father, and that the child then became the king, ostensibly. And this is kind of like, we see this in how many stories in history as well, real stories of sons taking over from fathers, and sometimes in the literal royalty, not in a good way. A lot of that was done in very unpleasant manners. So there was this resistance of the king to hand down his power, and there was this need for the son to get that power. And in here we do see an interesting patriarchal or masculine dynamic, the male power, the need for what power looks like as a male dynamic. So Uranus was overthrown by his son Kronos, and Kronos and Rhea were titans, and they, every time Rhea gave birth to a new baby, Kronos would eat the baby. And by the time, so goodness, I can't remember how many, maybe she'd eaten like 10 or 11, he'd eaten 10 or 11 of their children, at which point, and I'm pretty sure I mentioned this last month, but again, I'm just going to repeat, and please bear in mind that in myth, it's very incestuous and complicated, and depending where you hear the story, sometimes it doesn't ring quite true. So I'm giving a very light, easy Gemini broad overview of these things, just so that you kind of get a feel for where the archetypal dynamics and relationships are. Okay, if you love mythology, you might want to go a little deeper. You might want there's a woman that does these really fast YouTube videos. She's called the overly sarcastic productions. She does fabulous cartoon, quick, punchy, very informative things on gods and goddesses and mythology, and I love her things, but she goes fast. Heads up. Anyway, so here we have Ray giving birth to their final child, Zeus, and she's beside herself. She just cannot take this baby and watch her husband eat another of their children. So the trick comes in, which, as I say, I mentioned last time, where she wraps the baby in his clothes, swaddling clothes, gives him to his father, who promptly swallows him down without a glance. Meanwhile, it wasn't the baby. She'd wrapped a big stone in the swaddling cloth. And the real baby, Zeus, was ushered off to go and be raised on one of the Greek islands by goodness knows who, I can't recall, and kept secret and hidden and raised, at which point he would become old enough to come and take over from his father, fulfilling the prophecy. And when he did fulfill that prophecy and he cut open his father, all of his siblings, now fully grown, came out, and the three that became the main rulers of the lands were Pluto, who we did last time. He became the god of the underworld, Neptune, who became the god of the oceans, and Zeus, who was earth and sky. So here we have Zeus as the all-father. So Zeus, or Jupiter, as I said, we could look at him as Odin in the Norse mythology, or Amun-Ra in the Egyptian mythology. Most of the mythology has this all-father, in fact, I think Odin is called all-father. So where you find those all-father leading gods, center of the pantheon kind of thing, that is the archetype that we're working with here. So he's the king, he's the overall king. If we look at the planets, we can say, well, his father is still in the mix. Yes, that's Saturn. And his grandfather, Uranus, or Uranus, different pronunciations, is still in the mix in the planets, but Jupiter is the king, and his energy is that. He is the benevolent one. He is the generous one. He's larger than life. And from a power perspective, in many ways, he is that. But you can also see a little bit like if you looked, for example, at the English royal family now, the royal family doesn't have, it's really pretty much almost the only royal family that's still going. Please, I stand corrected. I'm not 100% sure how many royal families still exist, but the point is that they aren't really ruling the land anymore like they did in days gone by, where the king was also seen as the god. He was ordained by God. God put him in his position and he had the final say. He was more than just a figurehead, whereas now royalty has become more of a figurehead. And in some ways, I think that could be said for Jupiter too, because he's huge, literally, in his mass in the sky. He is by far and away bigger than anything else in our solar system, including our sun. And he is that kind of big energy. But Pluto, who we discussed last week, is this tiny little guy that packs a punch. He's got, in some ways, more power than his brother does. And obviously, they're not really siblings in the archetype, in the planets, but yeah, in the archetypes, he's got more power. And in some ways, so does Neptune. And Neptune's myth also is very interesting because in some ways, he predates areas of control that he's now given. He had the underworld, he had this, he had that. So it looks like Jupiter's the king of the world, but there are some little indications that maybe he's not quite as powerful as he thinks he is. Maybe he's just like the figurehead of the king. And even that with Saturn, which is another way that it's really great to look at the two together, is that Saturn is the furthest out. So we have Jupiter and then Saturn, and that's as far as the visible eye could see. So we didn't know beyond Saturn. Saturn has these rings around him, which are like boundaries. And he is the boundary for Jupiter because Jupiter can't get past Saturn. Even though he's now in charge, he can't get past his father. On the outside of that, we have Uranus, Neptune, Pluto. They have space. They have more space. They have, like, we could look at them as not having the boundaries that Saturn brings in. And we'll see next month when we go into Saturn. Saturn is all about boundaries and structures. Jupiter is just inside of Saturn. He cannot get past that. Interesting then, as we think about like childhood trauma and ancestral wounding and that type of thing, we might say, well, even if we've overcome stuff from our childhood or our ancestry, or let's take something extreme like World War II and what that did to the whole race of Jews moving forward. And I mean, I've never been raised Jewish, but I'm half Jewish. So, you know, that ancestral trauma that lives inside of me because of something that happened to a people that I feel it, but I never was raised that way. I didn't have the stories of it poured into my ears from my own people, but from the history books and that sort of thing. And yet there's that trauma that I will never fully be able to outgrow, get beyond, because it's there. And that's almost like the parent, Saturn, the trauma of Saturn, the boundaries of Saturn, the experiences of Saturn. It doesn't matter that Jupiter's now in power. He's still attached. It doesn't matter how much healing we do, we can never outrun our past, outrun our epigenetics, our ancestry, etc. So it is interesting to look at it from that perspective. But another thing I want to just say about Jupiter, beyond that part of his myth, is he then married his sister, as you know, these gods are wont to do, Hera, and she becomes this long-suffering wife who deals with a husband who is king and who is the all-father, the overarching god of the pantheon, wherever you're looking at him. And she just has him having affair after affair after affair. So in spite of the fact that they themselves had plenty of children, he also fathered numerous other immortal children and demigods with children that he had with mortals and nymphs and you name it. He became very, very clever at getting away with these things so that his wife wouldn't find out, because Hera became also really interesting how it brings in the feminine archetypes of she became that vengeful wife, that bitter and spiteful, and she would often smite the people that he'd fathered children with because she couldn't smite the all-father. So, you know, there it brings in another interesting dynamic of the power of a man and the undermining of a woman, where it turns the feminine bitter and twisted. And you know, there's more to Hera than that. And I think I have mentioned that when we've gotten through the main planets, I would love to go into the asteroid goddesses, especially as we're a woman group, and then we can really dive into the juicy aspects of going deeper into the feminine, because in our pantheon of 10 planets, Moon and Venus of all 10 are the only feminine archetypes we look at. Some will say at times we could look at Saturn as a she, we could look at Neptune as a she, but from traditional astrology standpoint, we would say that Moon and Venus are the only feminines. And when we open it up into the asteroid goddesses, then we can go a little bit deeper. If you've been reading my newsletters for years, I actually went through a whole spate of doing newsletters on the asteroid goddesses and covered them all. And so I do want to bring that into our astrology as we continue further down this line. But for now, just to say that Hera is this long-suffering wife who becomes bitter and twisted, and Jupiter kind of just gets away with everything. So he's kind of that guy who's like the lovable drunk, the happy philanderer. You kind of got to love him. He's got this charisma and he's got this charm, and he just gets away with everything. If you're the wife, you want to kill him, but you can't. So then you become aggressive at everyone else. So this aspect of Jupiter in myth, where it's like he is sort of lovable and revered and respected, but also doesn't always earn that respect. And so he never really knows when enough is enough. And from an astrology standpoint, which we're going to jump into now, he's mostly good. However, sometimes that larger than lifeness, that too muchness becomes a problem. And that's kind of how we also have to sometimes look at it in the astrology. But from myth, I think he gets away with murder. He certainly gets away with a lot of philandering and procreating. And oftentimes these women who father his children are raped, in fact. So he's I mean, he really is beloved, sometimes one wonders why. And again, maybe he's not. You know, maybe in myth it's just more feared than revered. But it does, like, we tend to look at him as big, joyful, generous, jubilant, all of these things. And those are true in the astrology, but I'm just pointing out in the myth. Like I said last month, I think that Hades should actually be given a little more credit, and Zeus should actually be downgraded on some levels. So, my goodness, I just realized I have a session now. So I will put a pin in it for now, and we will dive into the astrology shortly.